It didn't begin with the sound of cannons. It began with the whisper of parchment and a royal seal pressed in red wax. On the first day of the new century, December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a charter. It looked harmless enough, a trade license granting English merchants the right to buy and sell goods in the East Indies. But buried within that document was a weapon more dangerous than any sword. A legal empire in disguise. They called it the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. To the world, it was a business. To history, it would become something else entirely. A kingdom without a crown, an army without a nation, and a war machine that conquered a continent without ever declaring war. The arrival. When their first ships reached the shores of India in 1608, they didn't come as invaders. They came as guests. The Mughal Empire was at its zenith, a realm of wealth, art, and unimaginable power. Emperor Jahangir, son of Akbar the Great, ruled over lands richer than any European kingdom. The British envoys, led by Captain William Hawkins, bowed deeply before him, offering exotic gifts and promises of friendship. Jahangir, amused by their courtesy, granted them permission to trade. Small ports, minor settlements, a few warehouses along the western coast. No one noticed the shadow that followed them, a shadow that carried ledgers sharper than blades. These merchants had no army, but they had something far deadlier: contracts, credit, and calculation. They studied the land, its rulers, its people. Every handshake was an assessment, every gift an investment, and every friendship a future claim. A world divided by the mid-1600s, Europe was at war with itself. The Dutch, Portuguese, and French all fought for control of the spice routes. But England, small, cold, and desperate for wealth, turned its eyes toward India. India was not just a land, it was a treasury of the earth itself. Diamonds from Golconda, silks from Bengal, spices from Malabar. The British realized something profound. They didn't need to conquer India to rule it. They only needed to control its trade. So they built fortresses disguised as factories. They trained guards under the guise of protection. And they quietly began to draft rules that only benefited themselves. In 1639, they purchased a small strip of land from a local ruler and called it Madras. In 1668, they gained Bombay, gifted by the Portuguese as part of a royal marriage. And in 1690, they founded Calcutta, a city that would one day become the seat of their empire. 3 dots on the map, 3 silent weapons, and between them, a network of trade, bribes, and deceit that began to drain the subcontinent from within. The Hidden War. As the 17th century waned, the Mughal Empire began to show cracks. Emperor Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughals, fought endless wars in the Deccan. His treasury emptied, his nobles rebelled, and his armies bled in the dust. The British watched, they waited, they took notes. Every defeat, every rebellion, every tax dispute, they recorded it all, understanding that the real power of empire lay not in swords, but in timing. When Aurangzeb died in 1707, the Mughal throne was no longer a seat of power. It was a seat of chaos. And into that chaos, the East India Company would march. Not with battalions, but with bankers and spies. A new kind of empire. Imagine a company that could raise its own army, print its own currency, negotiate with kings, declare war and peace on behalf of a nation that didn't even own it. That was the East India Company. By the early 1700s, it had tens of thousands of armed men on its payroll. Sepoys, Indian soldiers trained and paid to protect British interests. But what those soldiers didn't know was that they weren't guarding trade. They were building a cage around their own homeland. Every fort they defended, every skirmish they fought, brought another province under company influence. And in London, shareholders celebrated record profits. They had no idea, or perhaps they did, that those profits were soaked in the future blood of nations. The invisible army marches on. From its London offices in Leadenhall Street, the company operated like a government. A board of directors met weekly. Votes were held, decisions made, alliances bought. Every move in India was calculated months in advance, a chess game across oceans. While the Mughal Empire fractured into smaller kingdoms, the company grew fatter, wealthier, and bolder. It funded local wars, backed rival princes, and supplied both sides, ensuring that no matter who won, the British always profited. The merchants who had once begged for trading rights now issued orders to Indian rulers. They were no longer guests. They were governors. The turning tide. By the dawn of the 18th century, the East India Company was no longer just a business. It was a nation in everything but name. It commanded armies, minted coins, and dictated politics. But its leaders wanted more. They wanted absolute control. And for that, they needed to remove the final obstacle standing between them and the heart of India, the Mughal viceroys of Bengal. In Bengal, the richest province of the empire, the British had found their perfect target, a land bursting with silk, saltpeter, and silver, guarded by rulers too divided to resist. What would follow next would not be a war of conquest in the traditional sense. It would be a war of manipulation, a battle fought in courtrooms, backrooms, and counting houses. A war where the British would wield treachery like a blade and win an empire without firing a single shot. The year was 1707. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, the last great ruler of his line, was dead. His empire stretched from the snowy peaks of Kashmir to the southern coasts of the Deccan. Yet it was already cracking beneath its own weight. For a century, India had been the richest land on earth, a jewel that glimmered under the sun of trade, culture, and conquest. But after Aurangzeb's death, that jewel began to fracture. The throne of Delhi became a battlefield. Princes turned on brothers. Governors became kings in everything but name. And into this chaos crept the company. At first, the East India Company still bowed to the Mughal throne. Its men stood humbly before imperial officers, trading silks and spices under the emperor's seal. But behind the silk smiles were steel ambitions. They had already learned a lesson, that India could not be conquered by force, at least not yet. Instead, it could be conquered by debt, division, and deception. From their ports in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, company men began to weave invisible threads across India's politics. They funded one prince against another. They loaned gold to desperate rulers and demanded land as repayment. They whispered to commanders that their salaries could be doubled if they turned their coats. And all the while, the Mughal treasury emptied. Trade declined. Armies revolted for unpaid wages. The once mighty empire became a shadow. Its emperor, a figurehead surrounded by hungry wolves. Meanwhile, in Europe, the balance of power was shifting. The British had emerged from decades of war with France. They possessed something no other empire had: a private army funded by shareholders, not by kings. This army did not fight for God or country. It fought for profit. Every musket fired, every ship launched, every fort built, all came from the company's ledger books. By 1720, the East India Company wasn't just trading goods. It was minting its own coins, fortifying its own cities, and governing British citizens abroad. India's princes saw the company as a useful ally, a neutral power with deep pockets. But that was the illusion. In reality, the company was learning, waiting, observing, watching how India's fragmented rulers tore one another apart. Then came Bengal, the empire's crown, a region of silk, sugar, and unimaginable wealth. Its capital, Murshidabad, glittered brighter than London itself. The Nawab of Bengal, Alivardi Khan, ruled with wisdom, but he too was trapped between enemies, Marathas in the west and the rising power of the company in the east. When he died in 1756, his young grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, took the throne. Impetuous, proud, and distrustful of the British, he saw them for what they truly were. He demanded that the company dismantle its fortifications in Calcutta and stop harboring fugitives from his court. But the British refused. Behind their refusal was Robert Clive, a man of ambition far greater than his rank. Clive was no aristocrat. He was once a clerk, bored and bitter, but India transformed him. He saw the subcontinent not as a colony, but as an opportunity to rewrite his destiny. And in Siraj-ud-Dowlah's defiance, Clive saw the perfect excuse. In June 1756, Siraj marched on Calcutta. He captured Fort William, the company's most prized possession. British traders fled. Dozens of prisoners died in what became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, a grim story the company would later twist into propaganda. London was outraged. Parliament fumed. The company demanded revenge, and so Robert Clive returned to Bengal, not as a clerk, but as a commander. He brought with him a few thousand men, British soldiers, Indian sepoys, and a fleet under Admiral Watson. But the weapon he trusted most was gold. Clive began to weave the same web of deception that had made the company powerful. He reached out to the discontented generals and court ministers of Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Men like Mir Jafar, commander of the Nawab's army, who felt slighted by his ruler. Clive promised him everything: power, gold, and the title of Nawab, in exchange for one simple act: betrayal. As these secret letters passed through the night, the stage was set for one of the most defining events in Indian and British history. By 1757, the fate of India rested in the swamps near a small village called Plassey. Two armies stood across each other. On one side, Siraj-ud-Dowlah with 50,000 men, elephants, and cannons. On the other, Clive with just 3,000 troops, most of them Indian sepoys. It seemed impossible. It seemed suicidal. But the outcome had already been bought and paid for. The battle that would decide the future of a subcontinent was not one of might, but of manipulation. As dawn rose over the fields of Bengal, the British fired their first shots. Thunder echoed through the mango groves, cannon smoke drifted across the Ganges, and behind it all, Clive waited. Because he knew something the Nawab did not. Half the army on the other side would never fire a shot. The conquest of India would not be written in the blood of battlefields, but in contracts, bribes, and broken oaths. The invisible invasion was almost complete, and by the end of that single day, India's destiny would change forever. The morning of June 23rd, 1757, dawned heavy and humid over the Bengal plains. Thunderclouds gathered above the Ganges, as if nature herself sensed what was about to unfold. Not just a battle, but the quiet beginning of an empire. Across the shallow riverbanks near the small village of Palashi, later anglicized as Plassey, two armies faced one another. On one side stood the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, commanding nearly 50,000 troops 53 cannons, and the mighty war elephants that had thundered across India for centuries. On the other side, Robert Clive, a man not yet 33, led 3,000 soldiers, most of them Indian sepoys trained under British officers. By numbers, the contest was laughable. By money, it was already over. The night before the battle, Clive did not sleep. He sat in his tent beneath the flickering oil lamp, reading and rereading the secret letters exchanged between himself and Mir Jafar, Siraj's most powerful commander. Those letters promised the impossible: that Mir Jafar would hold his troops back, that he would not fire upon the British, that when victory seemed certain, he would turn his allegiance to the company. The deal was written not on parchment, but on greed. And Clive, more merchant than soldier, had paid for it in gold. When dawn came, a thick mist blanketed the battlefield. The British troops took position under the cover of mango trees. The Nawab's forces stretched endlessly across the plains, drums beating, banners rising, cannons rumbling. Siraj's generals urged him to attack. He hesitated, torn between trust and suspicion. He had already heard whispers that his own men might betray him, but pride refused to believe it. At around 8 a.m., the first cannonball roared. The Battle of Plassey had begun. The Nawab's army unleashed its fury. Cannon after cannon fired into the tree line where the British hid. The air turned to smoke and thunder. But the rains soon came, heavy, relentless, drenching the field. The Nawab's soldiers, untrained in European warfare, panicked. They covered their cannons with cloth, afraid the powder would soak and fail. The British, however, had waterproof covers, a small detail, but one that would decide the battle. As the storm raged, Clive's men continued to fire, their musket balls finding their marks through the haze. And then came the silence, not of peace, but of betrayal. Mir Jafar's forces stood motionless. They neither advanced nor attacked. Thousands of soldiers, frozen in place, waiting for their commander's order. Siraj sent a messenger demanding that Mir Jafar move. No answer came. In that instant, Siraj knew the truth. The battle he thought he was fighting had already been lost, not on the field, but in the shadows of his own camp. Clive, seizing the moment, ordered his troops forward. The British cannons, smaller but faster, tore through the Nawab's lines. The elephants panicked, trampling their own men. The Mughal-trained infantry began to flee. By noon, the mighty army of Bengal, once thought invincible, was in chaos. When the smoke cleared, over 500 of Siraj's men lay dead. The British had lost only 22. But the real casualty that day was not human. It was India's sovereignty. As Siraj-ud-Dawla fled the battlefield, Mir Jafar rode into the British camp. Clive greeted him not as a victor, but as an ally. They shook hands, a moment captured in no painting, but etched in history as one of the coldest bargains ever made. In return for his betrayal, Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal. He was given the title, the palace, and the illusion of power. But the real ruler now sat behind a desk in Fort William, Calcutta, not with a crown, but with a ledger. In London, the news arrived like thunder. A private company, not the British government, not the king, had defeated a sovereign Indian ruler and taken control of Bengal, the richest province in the East. The stock price of the East India Company soared. Merchants who had invested in its ventures became overnight millionaires. The victory at Plassey turned a trading corporation into an empire within an empire. Clive was hailed as a hero. He was knighted, showered with titles, and returned to India as governor of Bengal. But his letters to London revealed a deeper truth. Even he was startled by the wealth he found. He wrote, "Such riches as one cannot conceive. The treasury is endless." And so began the systematic drain of wealth. Silver, silk, and lives flowing from India to Britain, feeding the rise of the Industrial Revolution. For the people of Bengal, however, Plassey marked the beginning of ruin. Taxes soared. The company demanded payments from peasants who barely survived the monsoons. Trade routes that had flourished under Mughal protection now bled under British greed. And when famine struck in 1770, millions perished, not from nature's wrath, but from the company's refusal to halt its grain exports. Clive himself returned to England burdened with guilt and suspicion. Accused of corruption, he defended his actions before Parliament, saying, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." He died soon after, rich beyond imagination, but haunted to his final breath. Yet the machine he built did not die with him. Plassey had proven that India could be ruled not by armies, but by contracts and corruption. The East India Company expanded its reach deeper into the heart of the subcontinent, consuming kingdoms one by one. Every treaty signed, every ruler dethroned, every soldier bribed. All followed the same script, first written at Plassey. India's conquest was now a business model, and the company's shareholders, sitting comfortably in London's coffee houses, were the silent conquerors of a nation. The sun set on Plassey that day, red and dim through the smoke. But in its dying light, a new empire rose, an empire not of kings, but of clerks, not of warriors, but of accountants. The flag over Bengal no longer bore the lion and son of the Mughals. It carried the red cross of St. George, fluttering not for faith or freedom, but for profit. The battle that lasted a few hours would echo for 100 years. And from the ashes of Bengal, the BritishRaj began to take form. One contract, one betrayal, one famine at a time. The year was 1757, and the smoke of Plassey still lingered over Bengal's fields. The cannons had gone silent, but the echoes of betrayal rolled through the land, like thunder over distant hills. What began as a company of merchants had become a corporate empire, an army of clerks and soldiers, bound not by loyalty to the crown, but by profit. Robert Clive's victory had opened a door no one in India knew existed. Behind it lay a new form of conquest, one that would not come with invasions or declarations, but with seals, signatures, and trade treaties that turned kings into customers. From Calcutta, the East India Company began to redraw India's map. It established its own mint, its own court of law, and a standing army larger than most European powers combined. In London, the directors called it the protection of British interests. In India, it felt like occupation. By 1765, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, desperate and broken after years of war, signed the Treaty of Allahabad. It was a masterpiece of deception. On paper, it restored the emperor's dignity. In reality, it stripped him of power. The treaty granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The emperor would still sit on his throne, but the money would flow directly into company coffers. It was the first time in history that a private corporation collected taxes from millions of people. The conquest of India had now been legalized. The revenue from Bengal poured in like a flood. Textiles, silk, opium, and indigo filled the company's ships. But with every ship that left, famine and ruin followed behind. The peasants who once thrived under Mughal administrators were now bound to quotas they could never meet. If they failed to pay, the company seized their land. If they resisted, they were branded rebels. In 1770, Bengal bled under one of the worst famines in recorded history. Over 10 million people, a third of the population, perished. But the company reported profits that same year. Their ships still sailed, their dividends still rose. In London, when asked about the suffering, one director replied coldly, "We are not in India to feed the people, but to feed our shareholders." The Mughal Empire had effectively collapsed. Delhi was a ghost of its former self, the emperor reduced to a pensioner under British protection. But across India, other powers still stood, proud, independent, and unwilling to kneel. In the south, the kingdom of Mysore, under the rule of Hyder Ali, and later his son Tipu Sultan, rose as a defiant flame against British expansion. Hyder Ali, once a soldier, had built a disciplined army equipped with European firearms and Indian ingenuity. When war broke out between Mysore and the company in 1767, the British expected an easy victory. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that fought with precision, strategy, and purpose. Hyder Ali's cavalry struck with lightning speed, outmaneuvering British columns at every turn. His rockets, simple but deadly iron cylinders, terrified soldiers unaccustomed to such weapons. The British called it a barbaric display. But those same rockets would later inspire the Congreve rockets, weapons Britain would use in future wars. When Hyder Ali died in 1782, his son Tipu Sultan inherited the throne and the fight. Tipu was no ordinary ruler. He was educated, visionary, and fiercely proud. He saw clearly that the company's expansion was not trade. It was enslavement disguised as commerce. He modernized his army, forged alliances with the French, and even sent envoys to the Ottoman Sultan. He called himself the Tiger of Mysore, a name that would one day adorn the golden throne in his palace, symbolizing his vow to never live as a subject. The wars between Tipu and the company became legend. 4 major campaigns, fought over decades, each more brutal than the last. Tipu's troops stormed British forts. Company armies retaliated with ruthless sieges. Cities burned, fields turned to ash. But beyond the battles lay a deeper game, one of espionage and politics. The company bribed Tipu's allies, promised wealth to traitors, and forged letters to stir suspicion among his ranks. When Lord Cornwallis, the same general who had lost America, took command in India, he vowed not to repeat his humiliation. In 1792, he surrounded Tipu's capital, Seringapatam. Tipu fought to the last breath. He refused surrender. His words before the final assault would be remembered for centuries. "Better to live one day as a lion than 1,000 years as a sheep." When the smoke cleared, Tipu's body was found among the fallen, sword in hand, beside the breach in the wall. The tiger had fallen, and with him, southern India bowed to the company. But the conquest was far from over. To the west, the Maratha Confederacy, heirs to the empire of Shivaji, stood as the last great Indian power. Proud, martial, and deeply independent, they ruled vast lands across central India. The British feared them not just for their strength, but for their unity. And so, once again, they turned to their most reliable weapon: divide and rule. In 1775, the First Anglo-Maratha War broke out, the company attempting to place its own puppet, Raghunath Rao, on the throne. The Marathas crushed them at every turn. The war ended in humiliation for the British, forcing them to sign the Treaty of Salbai, acknowledging Maratha sovereignty. But the company never forgot. They returned 20 years later, stronger, richer, and far more ruthless. The Second and Third Anglo-Maratha Wars unleashed a tide of destruction. The British struck alliances with rival Maratha factions, funded traitors, and manipulated succession disputes until the Confederacy imploded from within. In 1803, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, marched into the Maratha heartlands. His disciplined regiments met the fierce cavalry of the Peshwas, and for the first time, the Maratha lances broke before British gunfire. When the dust settled, India's last independent power had fallen. By 1805, the East India Company controlled nearly all of India's trade routes, ports, and capitals. Its private army numbered 260,000 men, twice the size of the British Army itself. Its ships dominated the Indian Ocean. Its governors acted as viceroys, its clerks as kings. The British Parliament, once sceptical, now realized the company was too powerful to control and too profitable to question. Fortunes were made from its dividends. Entire families in London lived on Indian taxes without ever setting foot on its soil. The historian Horace Walpole wrote at the time, "Half the wealth of Asia now belongs to a company of merchants." But beneath this empire of gold lay a sea of suffering. Villages starved while palaces gleamed. Textile weavers were forced to destroy their looms so British cloth could dominate the market. Indian artisans, once the envy of the world, became beggars in their own streets. Yet even as the company grew fat with power, it began to rot from within. Corruption spread like a plague. Officials sold offices to the highest bidder. Governors enriched themselves with bribes and estates. The British Parliament finally intervened. The Regulating Act of 1773, and later the Pitt's India Act of 1784, placed the company under partial government oversight. But it was too late. The machine had grown too vast to stop. India was no longer ruled by Delhi, nor even by London. It was ruled by ledgers, by trade monopolies, by clerks who signed away kingdoms with a stroke of a quill. The great game of control was complete. In just half a century, the East India Company had done what no empire in history had achieved. It conquered a continent not with swords, but with signatures. From the ashes of Mughal grandeur and the blood of Mysore and Maratha warriors, a new world was taking shape. A world where nations would no longer be won on battlefields, but in boardrooms. But the British had made one grave mistake. They believed fear could last forever. They believed that an entire civilization could be chained indefinitely. And in that arrogance, they had sown the seeds of their greatest challenge, a rebellion that would soon shake the company to its very foundations. By the dawn of the 19th century, the British had already transformed from traders into conquerors. The East India Company no longer hid behind ledgers and seals. Its power was enforced by cannon fire, bayonets, and the blood of kings. Yet, as the Mughal shadow faded, a question loomed over every fort, every court, and every battlefield. When does conquest end and empire begin? To answer that, we must step into the final act. The collapse of the Mughal illusion. The wars that stitched the British flag across the Indian subcontinent. And the empire that would define the next 2 centuries of history. The crumbling throne of Delhi. In 1803, the British East India Company marched toward Delhi, not as petitioners, but as the self-declared arbiters of destiny. The once glorious Mughal capital had become a ghost of its past splendor. Its domes were cracked, its palaces looted, its streets haunted by poverty and decay. Shah Alam II, the aged Mughal emperor, was blind, both literally and metaphorically, unable to see that the crown he wore was now only a symbol for others to manipulate. When General Gerard Lake's forces entered Delhi after the Battle of Patparganj, the Mughal emperor welcomed them with trembling hands. The British promised protection, but what they really claimed was legitimacy. They placed the imperial seal of Hindustan in their own hands, and in that single moment, the Mughal Empire ceased to exist in all but name. A Persian chronicler in the court wrote, "They came with the words of allies, but their steps were those of rulers." From that day onward, the British did not rule against the Mughals. They ruled through them, the shadow of the company. The East India Company now stretched from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. Its armies were no longer a mercenary force, but a standing military machine, disciplined, well-paid, and loyal to London's profit margins. Indian soldiers, sepoys, filled its ranks, commanded by British officers who believed in their divine right to rule. Each province, each princely state, was slowly drawn into the web, some through treaties, others through deceit. The doctrine of lapse became their silent weapon. If a ruler died without a direct heir, the company claimed his lands. Satara, Jhansi, Nagpur, one by one, the Indian thrones crumbled not in war, but in paperwork. And as the map of India turned increasingly red, resentment began to fester like a buried flame beneath the surface. A land in chains. The people who had once seen traders from across the seas now saw tax collectors and soldiers. British reforms reshaped centuries-old traditions. Land revenue systems such as the permanent settlement enriched landlords and devastated farmers. Crops that once fed millions were replaced with opium and indigo, commodities the company exported for profit. Hunger spread. So did silence. The Mughal emperor, now reduced to a ceremonial figure in Delhi's Red Fort, became a reminder of what had been lost. His poets still wrote of divine kingship and destiny, but the sound of marching boots outside his palace walls told a different story. To the British, India was not a land. It was an investment, a machine that produced silk, salt, and silver, all flowing back to London's coffers. The company's officials lived in palatial houses, while the Indian artisans who once crafted jewels for emperors now starved in their shadow. It was empire disguised as enterprise. The storm before the rebellion and history has a way of punishing arrogance. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company had stretched itself too far, ruling over 200 million people with fewer than 10,000 Europeans in India. Fear became its greatest weapon, yet fear, when mismanaged, turns into fury. The sepoys, the native soldiers of the company's army, began to whisper. They had fought countless wars for their masters, from the Burmese jungles to the Afghan deserts. But when rumors spread that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim faiths, the whispers became a storm. In 1857, the fire finally lit. It began in Meerut. A handful of sepoys refused the cartridges and were punished harshly. But the spark spread faster than the British could contain it. Within days, towns and cities erupted in rebellion. Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, names that would echo forever in the chronicles of revolt. When the rebel soldiers entered Delhi, they turned to the last Mughal, Bahadur Shah Zafar, pleading for his banner, his blessing, his symbol. The old poet king hesitated, but destiny pulled him back into the current. He raised his trembling hand and declared, "The empire of Hindustan stands once more." It was not true, but it was necessary. The fall of the company. For months, India burned. Villages were destroyed, armies slaughtered, cities turned to ash. The company's men called it mutiny. The Indians called it war. But in truth, it was both. A rebellion born of faith, pride, and humiliation. Jhansi's queen, Lakshmibai, became the face of resistance, her courage turning her into legend. The sepoys fought not just for revenge, but for the memory of their ancestors, the honor of their gods, and the ghost of the Mughal Empire that had once ruled the world. But the British response was merciless. Reinforcements from Britain arrived, armed with modern rifles and cold precision. Delhi was retaken. The Red Fort was seized. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured, his sons executed before his eyes. In the ruins of his empire, the last Mughal wrote a final couplet. Kitna hai bad nasib Zafar, dafan ke liye do gaz zameen bhi na mili, kuए yaar mein. How unlucky is Zafar that for his burial, even 2 yards of land were not granted in the land of his beloved. And so, in 1858, the British Crown officially dissolved the East India Company. Queen Victoria assumed direct control over India, and the empire was reborn, not as a business, but as a monarchy. The Raj had begun. The British Raj, the empire of iron and illusion. Under the British Raj, India became the jewel in the crown, but a jewel bound in chains. Railways, telegraphs, and courts were introduced, yet every reform carried a price. Education was allowed, but only to produce loyal clerks. Infrastructure was built, but only to extract resources more efficiently. The British declared themselves bringers of civilization, but the cost was measured in millions of Indian lives. Famines swept across Bengal, Orissa, and Madras, not due to nature, but policy. Crops exported for profit left fields barren of food. The Mughal emperors once ruled by faith and culture. The British ruled by bureaucracy and bayonet. And yet, beneath this oppression, a quiet awakening began. Indians who studied in British schools started reading about freedom, equality, and rights. Ideas born in the same Europe that had enslaved them. Men like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, later Tilak, and Gandhi would carry those seeds forward. But for now, the British flag flew unchallenged over Delhi, a silent mockery of the empire that once was. The end of an age. By the late 19th century, the East India Company was a ghost, a cautionary tale even in Britain. What began as a charter for trade had become an empire built on conquest, corruption, and arrogance. The Mughal Empire, which had once ruled from Kabul to Bengal, now existed only in poetry and memory. Its palaces became barracks, its thrones museum pieces, its kings forgotten. But history, as always, remains cyclical. The British, too, would face the same fate they once inflicted: rebellion, resistance, and finally, retreat. The conquest that began with a royal charter in 1600 ended not with a treaty or a battle, but with an illusion, the illusion of permanence. Empires rise not because they are destined to, but because others fall asleep watching them rise. And as the sun set on the Red Fort, a silent truth lingered in the air of Delhi. The East India Company had conquered India, but in doing so it had sown the seeds of its own destruction.